Okay, so dear friends, or whoever is listening, whoever will be able to keep up with us, we're finally moving on to the second perek, Pardes Rimonim. Now, as we've said, there's somewhat of a distraction. The Ramak, as Talmud Chachamim do, started. He's just to be clear, because it's clear to me that it's like this. His his intent in this chat and this entire gate is really just to give us the sources, the sources he considers the authoritative sources for the existence of 10 sefirot. And as we'll see in later in the Shad, he will start asking if there are only 10, or if there's some opinions that have 13, or some opinions that have only 9, and so on, 11 different numbers. And he's trying this, what the Shad is named, Shad Esivle Tesha, the existence of, or more precisely, the existence of this 10 Sefirot, and this number of Sefirot, 10 Sefirot. And he started a tiny bit to explain what he means by number in the beginning of the Perek Aleph, where it means they're not a number, but they are numbered in some way. And he didn't really explain what that means, and he told us to wait for later places where he does explain that. And now his method was to read everything from their sources, and since the first source for these 10 Sefirot was Sefer Yetzirah, he opened up a Sefer Yetzirah and started to read the Mishnah. What's called a Mishnah, right? It's not a Mishnah, but it's like language of the Mishnah. Maybe it was written in the times of the Mishnah by Rabbi Akiva, as he says. Now, once he did that, he opened up an entire long interpretation of this Mishnah and three different opinions on each thing, and so on. And it's clear to me that this is not, it's not me that's saying that this is a sort of digression. He himself understands that, and my big proof that I know have for this, that he himself understands it. Well, it's obvious to me, to whoever reads, but it's also in the Ramak himself wrote a sort of summary, very short summary, like literally for beginner summary of the Pardes Rimonim in Ornerav, in the second part or the end of Ornerav. And he definitely skips all of this over there. So the entire Shar Aleph becomes like three paragraphs. So that, besides for the fact that he just summarizes the main conclusions, he also skips this whole discussion. So this is not really a discussion from here. And not only that, if you actually continue up to Shar, the ninth Shar, which is Shar HaMachrim, that is really where most of these discussions belong. In other words, by the topical order of the book, that's where these discussions of what's right and left belongs, what's five against five belongs, they really belong there. And we'll see that he sort of understands that also in this discussion here, and he references it. There's a lot of things that are like backwards, like some things we need learning here that we really need to know what he's talking about over there. But this is, and then we come there, and then he says, "Well, I've already explained it in the first chat." So that's how it works. The reason for doing this, I don't know that there's an inherent reason. I don't know that there's a reason related to the content. But the reason is that this is his method. It's really his method of learning is to go through the sources, and at least we learn this: that if you want to learn something, you go to the source, and that's what happened. You open a whole book, and then you start wondering, well, where was this book from? What did it say before? What did it say afterwards? I've seen someone nowadays. There's a minhag in different places. I do it too, and I find it useful to create source sheets. There's a history to this, and just like everything else, it has a history. But people create source sheets that bring like one verse and one Mishnah, and that relates to that, and one later source and whatever, and that's like for their class, and that's what they learn. And I've seen someone complain about this and say that this is the worst way to learn, because you take everything out of their context, and you just read these lines, and if the teacher wants you to not know of anything else that says, or maybe in the next paragraph it contradicts his whole class, you're never gonna know. And in a broader sense, you lose a certain context, a certain, like, if you want to learn something the correct way, the real context would be to travel to the person's house and like speak with him, and you speak with his wife, and she gives you tea, and you open the door, and there's his friends, and there's, it's a living thing, it's a full-fledged thing, not like an abstracted line of thought or piece of paper. So since we're learning dead people, we can't really do that. You should do it with the live teachers that we have. We should definitely do that. Right? It's greater to serve or to learn in the way of serving from a teacher than to learn his words. you learn more about the words too, right? Because the words too, you need to understand their focus, what their emphasis is, which part is more important, which part is less. These are things that are Torah Shebal Peh, it's very hard to write down and maybe impossible to write down. And the same thing is for a book. If you take a book and you come to my class and I give you just like an excerpt of a page of a one page, you find one little thing, you find one piece of information. But you really need to know how to read. What's the language that book is written in, right? What are the things that he cares about more, right? So you need to know, what's the language, and sometimes it happens. Sometimes there's even entire sources. Sometimes we don't really know. We only know through quotations and later sources, and it's really hard to know if the person is just manipulating you or if it just has a not the pshat or not what's going on, because you need to have a familiarity with the entire way of doing things, the entire context, the greater context, the broader context. So at least the Ramak had this goodwill for sort of showing us his work, right? That the big value I find in this work is that he doesn't just give you his conclusions. And if you're just looking for clarity, you're just looking for information, this is what the Ramak's opinion of Kabbalah is. There might be easier ways to do it. There are summaries written by him and by other people on this, and we're going to write our own summaries and all of that. But if you want to do the Shimush Talmidei Chachamim, right? It says, like when we say Gdolah Shimusha, and we say one opinion in the Talmud says, if someone can learn everything, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, Gemara, and so on, you're still considered an ignorant person if you do not do that. And what part of doing that, and this is also some Mepharshim that explain this way, is learning the way of getting information out of the text, or the way of learning the text. So this is I think that's one of the reasons that he does this, otherwise it's hard to understand. He takes us along on his trip, and he says, okay, we'll open the Sefer Yetzirah. Wait, Sefer Yetzirah is a really hard book to interpret. Like he comments right in the beginning, this is something going on that's hard to understand. Well, it's our job. We need to figure it out anyways. And we're going to work on it, and we're going to do his method of listing questions, listing close reading questions, right? And all those questions are good questions. Sometimes they seem superfluous because the way he organizes them is not the way we're used to organizing things. But if you read something closely, and if you read more Zohar, you read with his Pirushim and others that go in this similar direction, you see that it's true. They're not, sometimes we can disagree. We can say, well, I think these two sentences that seem to be saying the same thing are saying two different things, but not the two different things that you're saying. Okay. But it's true that people, especially books that we take to have been written and with exactness, not just randomly throwing words together. And in the olden days, paper was expensive, so nobody just threw words together. So we learn how to do it, and that's one reason. There's another reason, the secret reason that I might have discussed there, which is that it's a test. There's the whole discussion where we're not supposed to teach secrets to everyone. There's supposed to be an entrance test to a school of secrets and so on. And the entrance test is basically getting through all of this. And if you have patience, and if you have the dedication, if you have the commitment to work through it, to not just say, well, let's skip it. And there might be legitimate, I'm not saying it's not legitimate if someone wants to reorganize it and do his own order and say, okay, we'll skip this, we'll get back to it at some point. You might want to do that. It's not what I'm going to do right now. I'm trying to be committed to this, because this is the initiation process. That's how you get initiated into the world and into the. Okay, so that's where we are now. Back to where we. Back to where we're saying. There's in general, he just wants to give us the source of Sfiras, and in order to do that, he would do Sefer Yetzirah, and then I'm just giving this context, but that's how the rest of the Shara is going to make sense to you. We'll bring other sources and Psukim and different later some Mamarei Chazal and so on. Now that we're in this Mishnah, so we need to interpret this Mishnah. So we read this Mishnah just to repeat the Mishnah. Where it says Eses Sfirot Beli Ma Mispar. Sentence number 1, Eses Sfirot Beli Ma, 10 Sfirot. The Ramak interpret 10 Sfirot which have number in some sense, but without Beli Ma, without essence, not an essence that we would assume that we can understand. Mispar Eser Hatzbot, in the count and the amount of the 10 fingers, and the Ramak explained this has a first meaning, which is that this is based on the pasuk which talks about God's fingers. There's many pasukim which talk about God's fingers, as we discussed, especially the pasuk Yeresh Shemecha Maseh Etzbotecha. So there are 10 fingers by which God creates the world and does everything else He does. And then the Sefer Yetzirah goes on to say Chamesh Keneged Chamesh Ubrit יחיד או ייחוד מכוונת באמצע, במילת לשון ובמילת מאור. 5 corresponding to 5, and the Brit, the single Brit, or the connecting Brit, the unifying Brit, in between them, with two Britot seemingly, one called Milat Lashon, the Milah, the word of the tongue, or the circumcision of the tongue, right, the Milah of the tongue, and the second one is Milat Ma'or, or that's the word or the circumcision of the Ma'or, meaning the Arva, or where we do Brit Milah. So that is the Mishnah. Now, Ramak went through this. We're right now stuck in Chamesh Keneged Chamesh. Now, just to be clear on this, I've found the Ramak wrote another commentary on Zev Yetzirah in Aryakar, in the part called the Shir Koma. And then he has a second commentary on Zev Yetzirah. Many times in this Mishnah he says, well, I've already explained this in Pardes, but I will explain it again. And over there also you see him, so firstly it's a second version, so it has some more clarity. This he was writing when he was in his 20s, and that's his later on. And secondly, it's also more summarized, so he doesn't do so much back and forth about the proofs text and things like that. He gives his summary of his view on the Mishnah and Sefer Yetzirah. And from there I learned today the clarification of what's going on here a little bit that I was struggling with, which is that Ramak understands the Sefer Yetzirah and this Mishnah as proving, this is in itself a Pshat that he has, we can think about it, but that's his understanding, that the Mishnah is proving the source of 10 Sefirot, of the number 10 Sefirot, from the 10 fingers, from the 10 Etzba'ot of God, which are mentioned in the Psukim. Right? And he understands the entire Mishnah, from beginning to end, as relating to this. This is his way of reading things, reading certain questions into the text which are not there, but that's his method, and sometimes it's true, sometimes it's a good method, and again, I think personally that it's a good method, although we can think of that if this is actually the question that Sefer Yetzirah had in mind. But anyway, in any case, that's his method. So he says, well, so the source is these psukim about etzbotecha. The question, and there's two questions or three questions that are important for him in this sugya, in this way. And the three questions, I'm going to just repeat them, what we learned earlier. The three questions are, one question is that there are 20 fingers. Why would we talk only about 10? And he sort of elaborates in this question, which is that if they are, he sort of elaborates in this question that if you'll tell me that one is really just a mirror or a shadow, as he calls it, of the other, then why don't you do the same thing with the right hand and the left hand and say there's only 5 and make one a mirror or a shadow of the other, right? And to that the answer is Chamesh Keneged Chamesh, in some sense. It's like Chamesh Keneged Chamesh is the answer to that. In other words, there's some connection, there's some way of working together with 5 and 5, which the 10 and 10 do not have, and that is Brit Yachid Mechuvenes Be'emtza, that the Brit connects 5 and 5 and 5 and 5, but does not connect 10 and 10, and therefore we see that there's really 2 sets of 10 and not 4 sets of 5 or 1 set of 20, right? Now the second thing, just because I understand what's going on here, there's a problem here, as we see later. Second problem, these are the 2 questions that I said, it's really 1 question. Now the second question is that there's a problem that if once we have Britya es Chamesh Keneged Chamesh u Brit Yachid Mechuvenet Be'emtza, there seem to be 11, right? In other words, he had the whole thing of the 5 and 5 and 1 unifying or mediating between them as solving the problem of there being 20, but then we seem to be ending up with 11, right? So that in itself is a question, and he seems like, I don't know if he thinks the Mishnah itself is thinking of this question, but he's definitely thinking of it in the interpretation of the Mishnah. Now, this is what I understood better today. And it's that there's Mishnah, the way he interprets the Mishnah itself is really on 2 levels. So the first level, I think that what I said, the second question is really related to the second level already. The first level is the Mishnah proving the 10 Sefirot from the fingers and this discussion of being 5 or 20 and 10. Okay. Now really, the answer to that has to be internal to that to that discussion, right? We see the pasuk says Yad Yamin. That seems Chamesh Keneged Chamesh seems to explain us why we understand the Sfirot being 10 and not 5 or 20. Now, there's really another thing when it says Chamesh Keneged Chamesh. What we've been doing now, in the last part, the last class, and the last part of the previous chapter, and now the next 3 chapters really sort of going through this, is another level of meaning really in the Mishnah. It's not relating to this question. So in a certain sense, we have enough from the Pshat that I just told you, that this 5 and 5 and 1 proves us that there's, and that's what he said, I forgot to say, that's why there's 2 machrim, right? Because we need 2. Since we have 2 sets of 10, we need Brit Yachid, Brit Lashon for the hands, 5 and 5, and Brit Ma'od for the lower 5. That's how these proves us that these are actually 2 sets and not 1 set, because then there would be only 1 machriya in between both of them, right? Being between the 10 and 10, or none, which would show us that maybe it's 5 only. No, there's a machriya between 5 and 5 which connects them, and a machriya between 5 and 5 which connects them. So that shows us that there's 10 sefirot, and the correct number to think of is 10 and not 5 or 20 or 11, which is another question that I don't know if it gets answered in that way. How is it not 11 if there's 5 fingers and the tongue or whatever connecting them? That's a problem. I don't know from this level he has a good answer for that, because his answer is in the second level that I'm going to tell you now, and I'm not sure. That's a question that I still have. But now there's another level of meaning in this whole thing, and that's the level, just like we discussed in the entire Sefer Yetzirah, that Ramak seems to know about this over here, which is that now that we have this like source, so we could call it the remes, or the source of the number 10. Now we're going on to tell you what these 10 are, right? Now these 10, in the language of the later Mekabalim, right? This language is not the language of Sefer Yetzirah itself, but it's the language of the Zohar of the later Mekabalim, is Keteh Chochmah Bina Chesed Gvura Teferet Netzach Chod Yesod, and especially organized in the way which they generally conceptualize them, the 3-column organization, which is what he's assuming here, although there's a whole Shar Seder Amidatam, which discusses what the correct way of organizing them is, but he's assuming more or less that organization that we know. Now, these 10 names, Keteh Chochmah Bina and so on, they sort of correspond. They are 5 and 5. But they're not themselves just the 5 fingers. It's not enough. It gives you another layer of information, or another layer of interpretation, really, to talk about these 10 sefirot as we know them. And that means that the Mekabalim and the Ramak, as he says, are going to now ask, okay, you told me that there's 5 fingers. That's enough. With 5 fingers, 5 right fingers, 5 left fingers. But now I want to know which of the 10 sefirot that we know are the right fingers and which are the left fingers. Or what are you really telling me about corresponding them, right? It's like just a correspondence, just a remes from this to that. There's 5 fingers, which proves that there are 5, and maybe in some sense, that's the source of it. The source meaning the textual source, right? The source of the idea of having 10. And now there is the second level discussion, which is in Keteh Chochmah Bina. Is there also a 5-5 correspondence? Because it's not necessary for this to be true, right? Of course, Mekabalim always want all correspondences to be fully fleshed out and fully exact, but it's not necessary for this to be so, right? Someone could have said, and I think that would be reasonable even in Pshat Sefer Yetzirah to say that yes, the 5, as the Ramak explained us very nicely, 5 and 5 is only to show us that the 10 is the correct number. Okay, now that we have the correct number 10, now this 10 is organized in whichever way you want. Maybe it's organized in 7-3, as the Mekbalim generally organize it, maybe in 6-1, 6-4, 9-1. It can be organized in 1,000 different ways. It doesn't necessarily need to be organized 5 and 5, right? And generally, this is actually true. Generally, when the Mekbalim talk about organization of Sfirat, internal to the Sfirat, they don't see 5 and 5 as the primary organization of it. It might be true that there's a way of understanding at 5 and 5, but they don't see that as the primary organizing factor in the 10 Sfirot, because they understand that, yes, the Sefer Yetzirah has 5 against 5. The Rabbanan says that it's like the Luchot, right? We have 5 of the Aseret HaDubrot on the first luach, the first lucha, I don't know how you say it, first tablet, and 5 on the second one. So that's very, very much so just nicely how the number 10, which of course the 10 Debrot are very important instance of the number 10, is divided in 5 and 5. Okay, but they don't generally think of that as the most important difference, as the most important way of organizing it. And there might not be any. We could just say that there isn't any. There isn't any way of organizing it in 5 and 5. There's ways of 3 and 7. There's different ways, not 5 and 5. 5 and 5 are just to prove us that there are 10. But the Mikabalim, the Mefarshim of the Sefer Yetzirah, beginning with the Ravid, which seems to be the Perish that Ramak is quoting here for the most part, they did associate the Sfirot himself having a 5 and 5 separation or 5 and 5 organization. And now the Ramak in these whole chapter, from the beginning, middle of chapter 1, and through chapter 2, 3, and 4, and we'll see there's a digression above a digression above a digression, but they're all to interpret this second level, to try to explain in which way can we find 5 and 5 in this Sefirot system, not necessarily in the finger system, right? Finger system is obvious. So this is the clarity that I've understood from this his other second commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, and he says this openly over there. So now what was it? This is what someone helps us to understand. This is not necessarily the most straightforward understanding of the Sefer Yetzirah, not the most important one either. But now what was it? So he said the first pshat was the very simplest way was just to divide them and cut them in half, right? 5 top spheres, 5 bottom spheres. Okay, and then what is the point of dividing them in half? We discussed that the Mekabalim said that the 5 higher ones are sort of spiritual spheres, or related to leading to man, Hanaga, by which God controls the upper worlds. Lower spherot are more embodied spherot, by which God controls the lower worlds, where there's bodies and things like that. The Ramak didn't agree with this interpretation of the meaning, but he did agree that there is such a structure, and I guess his understanding of the structure would be different. He didn't tell us what the meaning is, so we don't know. But that was the first Pshat, and it was the simplest way of associating them. Now, there's of course a problem that now what do we do with Brit Yachid Mechuvenet Be'emtza, right? How is that related to the second Pshat, to the second level of meaning in this whole Mishnah? And the Ramak really, in my view, somewhat struggled with this for mainly 2 reasons. That's what we're getting here now. He struggles with this very much. Now, further out of it, just to be clear, for which he's quoting, this was sort of not such a hard question, because since he understood, there's again a clarity that I have here. Since he understood that the 5 upper, the chamesh, the higher chamesh, are the more, we call them spiritual, might not be a nice word, but more spiritual, more abstract spheres, and the 5 lower ones are the more embodied spheres, the more physical, or more whatever you want to call it. So then it makes sense that we need something between these 2 things. Just like, and he says, this talks about Lashon, the tongue. Just like a person has in his mind, and he sort of puts all 5 sfirot, not entirely, so this is sort of a question, but in any case, we could sort of talk about a person, right? So again, the 3 and 7 makes more sense in this way, but that's still how the Ravid, it's not the Ravid really, right? Rabbi Yosef Ashkenazi says, where like to have, for example, you have your mind, your thoughts, and then there's like speech or the tongue, which articulates the thoughts that are in your mind and makes them come into action or come into reality, the lower reality. And there's something analogous happens in this Sfirot, where there's 5 higher level Sfirot, more thoughtful Sfiras, more intellectual Sfiras, and 5 lower, more sensible Sfiras, as they call them. And these have something in between them, analogous to the tongue in a human, which articulates, which brings one to the other. That was the Ravid's Pshat, so that's a simple Pshat. The Ramak doesn't seem to agree with this whole interpretation, or at least not in the way it was said over there. So therefore, he's left with a sort of a problem with how to understand the Brit. And his first Pshat, he seems to be clear that the reason why he moves from one Pshat to the other is because of this problem. This is one of the problems that he has. So this is lame. So of course, again, back to what I was saying, we could have said that, okay, you found the correspondence, you found the association for the Chamesh Keneged Chamesh in the Sfirot level, not only in the Pshat level of the fingers. You don't have to find for the Brit. Why do we have to associate every single thing? The whole reason, according to the Ramak, Pshat, the whole reason we talked about the Brit was to associate the 2 fingers one with the other. Okay, but it doesn't actually say that the Brit is a separate Sfirah. That's actually obviously not, because it says 10 Sfirot, not 11. If the 5 fingers and 5 fingers turn into 10 Sfirot, then obviously the tongue, which is in between them, is not an 11th Sfirah. That seems to not be able to be what the Sefer Yetzirah means. So maybe, like the Ramak explained, all it means is that there's a connection. But that connection is not a Sfirah by itself, but just another kind of thing, which is a connection. Now, if we want to go to now that we have the source for the 10 Sfirot, we go to 10 Sfirot, and with no need to find this connection in them, because it's only to find the connection in the source to be able to find the 10 Sfirot. That's what I would be able to say. I still say, in level of Pshat, maybe we could say that. But the Ramak and just like the Mekbalim, they still want to find the Brit in the Sfirot. So they did find, and of course for the Mekbalim, this turns into an important thing in Sfirot, having something Machria be'emtza, which is not the same thing as Mechuvenet be'emtza. Mechuvenet, it just means like it's exactly in the middle. It's not, doesn't actually say that it's Machria between one and one. Of course, later, the Sefer Yetzirah does say things like that, Chak Lashon Machria, so maybe it's being interpreted in light of that. So, anyways, so the first Pshat Ramak. So now the Sefer Yetzirah said that Lashon is the Bina. Bina is Machria between up and down, right? How does he do that if he's in the wrong place? He didn't really explain what happens with the Chesed and Gvura, which seem to belong under the Bina. Okay, I don't know. He doesn't answer that question. Maybe someone could figure out how the Ravid understands it. But that's how he says. And it actually makes nicely sense, just like the person's tongue produces or reveals what was in his thought. Okay. But the Ramak said that Lashon is not Bina. Lashon is Tiferet. And then he said, well, everyone knows Lashon is Bina. No, the difference between Lashon and Milat Lashon. Okay, that was his textual base, his textual source for this interpretation. And he said that it's the Tiferet. And how is the Tiferet Machria? Because Tiferet, now we are really for this, to make sense, we need to know the Ramak's whole structure of Tiferet, and he sort of references it and brings it somewhat at length. But his idea of Tiferet is in the person's body. But it's not only his body, it's also what the Ramak calls Das, and it has a part of it, or a mitziut of it, he calls, or a bechina of it, which goes up into the mind, or into the Chachma and Bina, and brings the Shefa of Chachma and Bina down through the entire system, and down until the Netzach Hanod and Yisod. So in that sense, Tiferet is Machria between everything and everything in a certain sense, and that's the first Pshat. Right, so Tiferet Machria between the higher, right? He goes to Ches Chachma Bina, and he is the Dat when he goes to Chachma Bina, and then through that brings together the right and left hand, and also brings the Shefa to the that's a Chod Yisod. So that's his first Pshat. This Pshat seems to be missing something. What is the problem with it? One is that the entire idea of the Machria being between top and bottom seems to be off, because that's not really a Hachra'a. I'm just interpreting what I think, why he's not happy with that Pshat. He says, it's a better Pshat. Why is it a better Pshat? I think this is one of the reasons, at least, it's a better Pshat. Because that's not, and it's also not the standard way. Of course, like he said, there's sources in the Zohar for this understanding of top and bottom Sfirot, but it's not the standard way of understanding, and it's also not a really good way of understanding the concept of Achra'a. Achra'a generally seems to be understood as something that happens between right and left, between Chesed and Gvura, or some sort of variation of that, not between top and bottom, which we would call Ashpa'at Shefa or things like that. I don't know if we would call that Achra'a, or at least in a simple sense. So, we're off to our second Pshat. And as he said, the second Pshat is also Muskam b'Devrei Rashbi b'Mekimot Rabim. In other words, I don't know if it means the interpretation of Chamesh Keneged Chamesh meaning this. I don't remember. I didn't search. We have to check if the Zohar ever interprets this line of Sefer Yetzirah at all. But he means is the concepts, the ideas, the Yisodot that he's quoting here are in the Zohar many places. So therefore, it's true in that sense. And what would be the understanding? 5 mimin, 5 mismol. 5 mimin are 5 sfirot. So not that there's top and bottom. There's right and left, which makes more sense to him. And which are the 5 sfirot? So this is something. There's a problem, right? Because everyone knows. If you don't know, then I'm telling you now that the 10 sfirot are generally organized in. This is the organization that he's thinking of generally in 3 columns, right? So the right column, the top, there's Keter, in the middle column. Then the right column we have Chesed, Chochma, Chesed, Netzach. In the left column we have Bina, Gvura, Hod. And the middle column we have Keter, Tiferet, Yesod, Malchut. Right? That's the 3 column layout of the Sfirot. In other words, these are considered left, right, and middle. And the meaning of that, as he explains much later in Shara Machrim and Saramut Vanagan, the general meaning of that is that there is Chesed is grace or giving, and the Gvura means harshness or punishment or judgment, and both of these things to the excess are not good, or not usually what we need. So therefore, there's something in the middle, which is the tiferet or the dat or whatever it is that machria that creates some sort of mediation between these two extremes of chesed and din. And in other words, this is interesting if we'll think about it. This entire idea of 10 sfirot, at least from the perspective of this kind of hanaga and this kind of hachra, is really there's more basic ingredients. The more basic ingredients are there's these three things: chesed, din, and what's not chesed, what's in between chesed and din, or what's mediates chesed and din. Anyways, that's a discussion for another time. So now, so the Ramak says we obviously don't have. So now that we understand that there's sides, right, left, which more or less mean the concept of them means chesed and din. We need to find a way to make them 5. Now there are not 5 sfirot on the right and 5 on the left. There's 3 on the right and 3 on the left, and 4 in the middle, or however exactly you want to count it. So there's not 5 and 5. So the answer is that the middle, so the right and the left rows are simple. There's 3 and 3. So we just need to find 2 more for the right and 2 more for the left. And we need to decide to divide the 4 middle ones in the correct way. And this is what he does. He's going to give us the facts, and then he'll give us the explanation why he divided these middle ones in this way. In other words, although they're, and that's what his definition is, they're not on the right, but they're note. So they sort of angle towards the right, or they sort of bias towards the right. In a certain, although they're not right by themselves, some other ones are also biased or note. So the 5 chesed are Gdulan. So I'm just going to show you so I can understand. Gdulan netzach teferet. I'm sorry. Chochma chesed. That's why it looks like this. Chochma chesed netzach. Right. These are the classic right sfirot. So those are not a question. Chochma being on the right side, right brain. Chesed right hand. Netzach here right leg. That's the correspondence to the human body. Are the right side. Okay, no problem with that. Now, which other ones are on the right? So the highest one in the middle, in Kavem Tzai, which is Keter, is considered the right. He doesn't explain this in going on, but the meaning of it is simple, right? Since it's the highest one, so it's considered the most pure, the most lofty, the most abstract. So it's Keter is where we have Rachamim, compassion. So that belongs on the right, because generally, besides for right and left, Chesed and Din being right and left, really Chesed is always the higher one, because God has only Chesed, and Din is something that only comes in to existence once there's creation in different ways. So Keter, which is the higher one, is always going to be pure Chesed. Okay, in general, these are his Pshat. Now Chachma Chesed Netzach are simple, and Teferet is also going to be in Yemen, and is going to explain in a minute why. And I think the same thing is in the left. The 5 left ones will be the 5 Sfirot, which are for the most part Din, right? Although not all of them are literally Din, which is left, and these are, so again, Bina Gvura Hod, simple, and Yesod Malchut, also simple. Now, if you really think about this, what I just told you is another rule, it's really simple, because just like I said, that Chesed and Gvura can be said to be right and left, which is generally how we say that, but in a certain sense, they also can be said to be up and down, because whatever is higher is going to be always more Chesed, and whatever is lower is going to be more Gvura. That's another rule or another klal of things. So therefore, if we just take the Kavem Tzai, the middle things, which are what? Keter, Teferet, Yesod, Malchut, and divide that in half. Well, we can't divide it in half vertically because it's the middle. But we could divide it in half horizontally, right? We could, or however I'm thinking, right? You could divide it in half from top to bottom, not from right to side. So we end up with Teferet and Keter being on the right side because they're on the top, and Yesod and Malchut being on the left side. So this is really, and then this is really the more basic logic of this, but he's just going to explain how this works. And really, it's another way, more an elaboration of what I just said. He said, everyone, Teferet really is in the middle. So, Mate Klape Chesed is the language of the Gemara, relative Verav Chesed, Mate Klape Chesed, which basically what the Gemara means is that if the heavenly, how do you call it? Heavenly scales are balanced. So one of the midot rachamim is that there's always a bias towards God. In other words, when it's 70-30, then whatever it is, the most, the Rav is going to win. But if it's half and half, so Benoni, we get Matek Lape Chesed. It's pushed to the side, to the right side. So, and the same language was used by the Zar and Kabbalim for the Tiferet. In other words, although we have Chesed on one side, the Gvura on the other side, then Tiferet, which should be totally fair and balanced, right? And that's to be exactly in the middle. And turns out not to be exactly in the middle. Turns out to be slightly on the right. Because there's a bias. There's a bias in Tiferet. It's also called Midat HaRachamim sometimes. It's biased to sort of finding a mediation which is more sweet. That's the idea of Tiferet. So therefore, he's Yetok Klape. Now, right, the Keteri didn't explain, as I said, I think that's obvious. And now, let's go to the left side, Binah. Now, the Binah is also, seems to not be controversial, because obviously Binah is on the left side, just like Chokhmah is on the right side. But the Ramak needs to comment on this, since there's a controversy about this, because the Ramak, just like we just said, there's really two. We need to remember two dimensions. We're discussing which Sphira is Chesed or Din. And since Binah is on the higher dimension of the Sphirot, in the higher vertical dimension, so it seems to be a problem for the Ramak. The Ramak, in place where he's referencing, Sharmut Faraga, at length really disagrees with people who understood Binah to be Din unambiguously. So Binah, although it's on the left side, it's the left side of the head, of the mind, or of the higher level Sphirot, what's called Shlosha Rishonot. So therefore, it cannot be simply Din. But the Ramak says it's still considered, just like we said, our 5 and 5 are not lit simply Din. There are Sphirot that are Notek Laped Din. They have something to do with Din. And Binah is Notek Laped Din. Why is Binah Notek Laped Din? Because his language is that he uses now Ki Yinekrat Po'el Gevurot. Ki Mimena Mita'arin Dinin. The Ramak is very specific in this language, and he's building on the Zohar over there. The Binah is called, for example, Po'el Gevurot, so the doer or the actor of Gvurot, but not Gvurot. She is Po'el the Gvurot of the Sfirat HaGvura, or of the lower Sfirot, but she is not herself Gvura, or he calls it Minah Dinin Mitarin Dinim, awaken or arouse from Binah. That doesn't mean that she is Binah, that she is Gvurot. She is the cause of Gvurot, but she is not herself Gvurot. But since she is the cause of Gvurot versus Chachma, which, for example, is the course of the cause of Chesed, she is considered to be on the left side of this structure that we just have. Same thing Hod. Again, Hod, he should not be need to justify, but I'm not sure why he justifies the Hod. He says, Hod, Olav Ne'mar v'hodine pach alay l'mashchit, but this is referencing a much greater drush that we have to discuss later in Shari Yerich Yaakov and other places where the Zohar and other Mekabalim understood the bigger part, the big source of evil, the big source of harshness and din to be in this Firat Hod, as it says, V'hodine pach alay l'mashchit. Of course, this is sort of a midrash on the pasuk. It doesn't literally mean that, but they said that the Hod became into a destroyer for me. So since the Midat Hod can become a destroyer, and this is also a famous drash on the pasuk Kol Hayom Dava. So Dava is letters Hod. So Hod can be Hod, but if you switch one of the letters, which is called Siruf, as he sees later, this is can be Dova. So Hod can have a harshness in it. In other words, it's not le din. And the same thing is Yisod. Yisod is in the Kav Tz'i. So again, it seems to be in the middle. Why would we associate it with din? So he says, Yisod gam ken ikarnet yato el tzad ha'gvura. Basically, what he's saying about Yisod here is that Yisod and Tiferet are the two middle sfirot, like the two lower middle sfirot, right? We have that, which is not a real sfirah. According to the Ramak, it's only the Tiferet when it's in the Bechinat, Be'ometziyut of Chokhmah Binah. But in the 6 lower sfirot, we have Tiferet, which is Machriya between Chokhmah and Binah, Chesed and Gvura, sorry. And we have Yisod, which is Machriya between Netzach and Hod. That's the simple way of saying it. But there's a difference between these two Machriim. The Tiferet, as we just discussed earlier, is not Teklach by Chesed, always biased towards the right side. But the Yisod is just the same thing. He is in between. He's in between the right and the left, but he has an opposite bias. He's biased towards the left. He's not Teklach by small. So if, for example, there's some reason to do something bad, but should be not entirely on the left side, it's somewhat on the right side, that would be go through the Yisod. And he quotes the Rashbi in Sefer Tikunim and Gabet Shia Berina, in a place where he discusses the 10 kinds of Negina, 10 kinds of languages of Sefer Tilim, and he says the 9th one, which corresponds to Yisod, is called Rina, and he says V'tzadik natil mismala, v'amidadem tzita natil mimena. So it said tzadik, which is the name for the yisod, is natil means takes from, right, or is connected from the left, and amidadem tzita, the middle column or the middle pillar, which is a name for teferet, is natil, or is takes from or sourced from uh, yamin, from the right side. So we see this thing that the feret, which is the middle, it's although it's the middle, it's no tekla bechesed. Yisod, although it's the middle, is no tekla be small. But od be'er sham, another place, and also continuation of that, it says binyan ze'atzmo, in the same drush, in the same context, it talks about, it says tzaddik iyu natil lismala. The tzaddik is goes to the left, which is called the iyu Yitzchak. So Yitzchak, famously, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, or Chesed, Gvurat, Teferet, and the Yisod is tzaddik, and we can find this in the word Yitzchak, because Yitzchak is Ketz Chai. Chai Almin, Katir Bismillah. Chai is a name for Yisod, El Chai is called the Yisod, and Ketz Chai, we see that Ketz is like the end, so sometimes there's like a harsh end, which is another whole discussion, but it's Kitzim, Ketz HaYimin, and Ketz HaSmol. And Yitzchak is Ketz Chai, so the end or the conclusion of Chai, in other words, was Yisod. So you see that Yisod is connected to Yisod is connected to how do you call it? To the left side. So again, this is his justification for putting the Yisod into the left column here, into the 5 of the left. This like, okay, this here is not going to give into the temptation to explain us the whole Tikkun Zohar about that right now, although the next piece is going to do it. He is going to do it. But conclusion we learn from this in general, Teferet is noted to Timin, the Yisod is noted to small. Maybe this is one of the reasons why we have these two machrim, and there's a whole Shara machrim which discusses all of the questions related to these achraot or mediators. And he says one of the reasons why there's two, can't we have Lowy? Because sometimes we need to be machriya, always need to be machriya. You can't ever have entirely kitzoni, entirely on one-sidedness can't be, but there is sometimes we need to be machriya more to yamin, and sometimes not as small, so that there are two machriim, which is called teferet and malchut. Teferet and yisod. Now the malchut, although she doesn't seem to always entirely associate with a kaf, generally when we make a picture we put her in the middle. It's not entirely accurate, but there's a whole other discussion about that. But im kozeh malchut kam ken ikrat din, shkan mefusam shema b'fi kol ha'mekubalim she nikrat midat hadin rafa. Midat hadin rafa was a language from the Ramban, from the Zohar, which always talked about two kinds of midat hadin rafa, the weaker midat hadin, or the softer midat hadin, and midat hadin hakasheh, the harsher, the stronger midat hadin. Midat hadin hakasheh is the tzfira of gvura, which is obviously gvura. So it seems like when he's talking in this whole discussion, seems to assume that gvura is the only one that's unambiguously simply din. Everything else we need some explanation why it's connected to din. Bina, gvura, hod, yisod, malchut, right? These are the 4 other dins. And malchut is also a simple one. Because malchut is known to be midat adin, bet din shel mata, sometimes called the bet din, the place. If you understand the structure, basically, gvura is like if you have a bezdin. The dayan that says chayev, that's the midat gvura. Then the yisod is like the shamash that takes the action or decides how to actually formulate the psak din. And then the malchut is like the actual action of hitting, or the actual action of carrying out the punishment, which is called midat adin. So the process of taking action, that's called midat malchut, and that's why it's midat adin afa, because it's not the harshness of din as it's in the mind, or as it's in the when the dayanim are discussing chayev. That's very strong. That's very clear. But the malchut is always midat adin afa, and there's already some rachamim in that. It's a lighter or softer midat adin. But anyways, that's called midat adin afa. So anyways, it's still midat adin. It's not midat chesed. It's midat adin, and therefore it also belongs to the left column. Bafal so another Ramak says that you could find some other places which seem to disagree with the structure that I just gave in Ktsat Mekomot. Well, that's not important. These are the basic. Advarim ele yisodot misodot k'masmerot netuim. So vadin din emet. This is the truth. If you find some exception, it's an exception. It's some other thing. It's not. There's always like the main way, the normal way of understanding things. And then there's like always. So anyways, this is now we understand. So the right hand is these 5. Kete chochma gdula netzach teferet. The left hand is bina gvura hod yisod malchut. And what's in the middle? Teferet. Again, will have to be in the between. So again, this is another doichek in this fourth pshat. We'll see the third pshat doesn't suffer from this doichek. That's why he wants to go to his own third pshat, although it's a very elaborate, far-fetched pshat in itself. At least doesn't have this problem where the machriya is really one of themself, right? The feret is calls Brit Lashon, as I said earlier. That's Machriya between Chesed and Din. Well, we just said that Tiferet is no Tekla Pe Chesed, so it's on the right side. It's still, that's one of them. So this is a Dechek. This is a problematic Pshat. It's really not a simple, not Kishmak. It doesn't really work, but that's the best he can do. And the same thing the Brit, although, and according to this, he sort of wants to put the Brit as being the Tiferet also itself. So both Britot, Brit Lashon and Brit Ma'or are both the Tiferet, although Brit Ma'or generally is the Yisod. And according to this, Yirmoz Gankin at Tiferet, because the Zohar says many times, the Tikkun Zohar mainly, that Guf Brit Chashvilan Chad, we could count the Guf and the Brit as part of one thing. It's and if you look at a person's body, you'll understand why the Guf and the Brit can be said to be part of one part, or only one part of the person. It's not like two parts. So sometimes we can only count it as one. So when Brit Ma'or, it's basically, according to this Pshat, Machriya between the 5 right and the 5 left is the Tiferet. Or maybe not the Machriya, but the connection. This goes back to what he was saying. This is just a way to put that there's a connection between the 5 and 5 and not between the 10 and 10. So that's the second Pshat, which he took from the Mefarshim, also the second Pshat in this Chamesh Keneged Chamesh. And as I said, it also has the problem of it doesn't have a problem of having the 11th, but it has a sort of the opposite problem, where it doesn't seem to have any real function for the middle one here, because the whole idea was that, if you think about it, there's something really circular in the whole logic here, because the whole idea of the right and the left, we understand that they're right and left, but then he said, well, some middles have in their hachra'ah, they're not tekla pechesed, no tekla bedin, and therefore, so now what are we doing with the bris yachid mechavenet be'emta, which is supposed to talk about the hachra'ah? You can't go after the hachra'ah and talk about the hachra'ah again. It doesn't really add up. But of course, it answers the problem. He never wants to be 11 sfirot, because we have a later Mishnah that says esev lo achadesher, so that's a problem. We can't have 11 and 5 plus hachra'ah. But we also can't have 5, and one of those 5 is randomly hachra'ah. That seems to also be a word doichak. Doesn't seem to entirely work. So therefore, he's going to go to his third pshat and give his third pshat, and we'll do that next time, God willingly, if we can.